Hello, thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you've had a great day so far. I know the agenda is full of really awesome, interesting talks, so thank you so much for coming along to my session. We'll be chatting about getting started with Blazor, and although we can't be in Glasgow together this year, hopefully I can bring a wee bit of Glasgow to wherever you are in the world. So let's get started, and we'll kick off by saying a huge thank you to our sponsors. So ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, Redspire, Agilysys and Hitachi Solutions. Hopefully I've said all of those right, or close enough to right. Thank you so much. We all know that these community events couldn't happen without awesome sponsors. And also a huge shout out and high five and thank you to the volunteers and organisers of Scottish Summit. So much time and effort has went into it, and the lineup and how many tracks and talks there are just really shows how much effort's went into it. So thank you all so much. And before we get started, I'll just say a hello from me and introduce you to me. So I am Carole. I'm a development team leader and .NET developer at Equator in Glasgow. If you can't tell from the accent already, I'm based in Glasgow, and I'm a Microsoft MVP. And you can catch me on Twitter and on GitHub at crgrieve, the handle that's on the screen there. I'd love to say hello and see what y'all are doing. So today the agenda looks a little bit like this. We'll chat through my history as a .NET dev and how I've seen kind of web technologies change over the years. We'll have an introduction to Blazor. We'll chat about the different types of Blazor. So there's Blazor Web Assembly and Blazor Server, and we'll discuss those. And we'll get started from the very beginning as looking at a Blazor project, and we'll chat about what's next for Blazor and upcoming versions of .NET. So as I mentioned, we'll give a little bit of a history of what my .NET career has looked like and how I've seen things evolve building websites within .NET ecosystem. So I started off with MVC. Thankfully, some might say, I never had to work with web forms. So I was actually a Java developer when I first graduated from uni. So my first 2-3 years I was working in Java. And when I started over in .NET land, MVC was what was used. So I never had to really use web forms. But I know for some people this slide would have a step before what I'm showing, which would be web forms. So I started off in ASP.NET MVC, and that's how we rendered the website. We used controllers and for our logic, and we had Blazor to render the front end. But then I've seen things evolve through many of the JavaScript frameworks, and the one kind of constant throughout that was that the .NET side of things was being done using Web API. We would still have our controllers, but they would give JSON or XML to the front end frameworks, and they would render the front end. Angular and React are the two examples that I've given here, but I know a lot of folks use Vue and so many other frameworks that there are. So I was really interested when I heard about Blazor, and we'll chat a bit about Blazor obviously in a second to introduce it properly, but for me, being able to use C# and .NET to do that rendering like we did in MVC, but still getting all the benefits of the JavaScript frameworks was really, really intriguing to me. So one of my jobs as a tech lead is to kind of know what's the next technologies out there. Is it going to catch on? Is it going to be suitable for our clients and for our development workflow? So that's why I first started having a look at Blazor, and take you all on the adventure that I've been through in that journey. So to start off at the very beginning, what even is Blazor? Blazor is an HTML framework similar to React and Angular and Vue, and it's used for the rendering on .NET on the client side and runs under WebAssembly. We'll chat about what WebAssembly is a bit later on, but the thing that really caught my eye when I was looking at Blazor was that it offers all of the benefits of modern front-end frameworks while working entirely in C#. And that working entirely in C# bit was the bit that, as a C# developer, obviously, was really, really interesting to me. And this kind of makes me laugh. It's like no longer having to keep up with all the JavaScript frameworks. We can write C# in the browser. So it means not having to, learn Angular, learn React, learn Vue, or whichever one is next. We can use all of our C# skills in the browser. So In Blazor, it lets us write C# instead of JavaScript, and to leverage the existing .NET ecosystem of .NET libraries, and also to share our app logic from the server and the client side, and benefit from .NET's performance and reliability and security that comes from, it being such a mature framework that we have been using for years. And we can use our common set of languages and frameworks and tools that they're stable, they're feature rich, they're easy to use. And I think one of the things that was important to me and to a lot of other .NET developers that I know is that we know the tools, we know the frameworks, we know the libraries, and it kind of makes that getting started in the new framework that much easier. So one of the main things to discuss when we're discussing Blazor is client side versus server side. So let's jump in and we'll chat about client side first. And Blazor client side allows us to have C# code and files and Razor files compiled into .NET assemblies. The assemblies and the .NET runtime are then downloaded into the browser, and the Blazor client side bootstraps the .NET runtime and configures the runtime to load the assemblies for the app, and Blazor client-side runtime uses JavaScript interop to handle the DOM manipulation and the browser API calls, and we'll go into what that means in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. So this is how it looks like. This is from the .NET docs, and I thought it was a really good visualization of where everything is happening. And for Blazor client-side, it's all in the browser, as you can see from the diagram here. So there's the DOM, that if you're familiar with web technologies, you'll be familiar with this. And as you'll see, it's Blazor in the browser that keeps the DOM updated. So as the user's clicking around and things are being refreshed on the screen, it's not doing a full page reload. It's dynamically updating the DOM with what it needs to be updated with. So it's probably the right time to chat about WebAssembly. So what is WebAssembly? You'll often see it kind of abbreviated to WASM, and it's a compact bytecode format optimized for fast download and maximum execution speed. WebAssembly is an open web standard and supported in the web browser without plugins. So some of the key points here for me was fast download and maximum execution speed. So we want our applications to be as fast as possible. And the fact that it's an open standard and it's supported in web browsers without plugins. So you will have to have a look at browser versions and which versions WebAssembly is supported in, because it's relatively new. But the fact that it can be used in browsers without having to install anything will be what makes it really kind of future-proof and more accessible for users. The JavaScript interop that we mentioned a few slides ago allows WebAssembly code to access the full functionality of the browser via JavaScript. And the .NET code is executed via WebAssembly in the browser, and it runs in the browser's JavaScript sandbox, so that's how we can even run .NET code, but in the browser. So to have a look at the other side, Blazor server side provides support for hosting Razor components on the server in an ASP.NET Core app. So if you're a .NET developer already, then a lot of that will look familiar to you if you've had a look at ASP.NET in the past. And the UI updates are handled over a SignalR connection, and the runtime handles sending of those UI events from the browser to the server, and it applies the UI updates sent by the server back to the browser after running the components. The connection used by Blazor server-side to communicate with the browser is also used to handle the JavaScript interop calls. And to visualise this a wee bit better, that's in a slide in a second. But first, SignalR. So ASP Core SignalR is an open source library that simplifies adding real-time web functionality to apps. Real-time web functionality enables server-side code to push content to clients instantly. So again, there's none of that reloading of the page. It just looks like it's happening dynamically. Content updates on the screen without having to reload the page. And here's the diagram I meant. So this shows how it interacts with the browser. It's a wee bit different, as you can see, from the one that we saw for client side. So the DOM is of course still in the browser, that's not going anywhere, but how that gets updated is there's an ASP.NET Core server-side app hosted, and it's SignalR that keeps those up to date. And a really interesting thing is that the SignalR updates the DOM, but it doesn't update the whole thing every time. It just updates the bits that have changed. Kind of does a diff and sees which bits have changed and only updates those. And that's really important because it's much better for performance. So let's get started. There are several ways to get started. We'll chat a little bit about in the command line first, and then I'll show you how we can do it in Visual Studio. So we can do .NET New, Blazor WASM, or we can do .NET New, Blazor Server, and as you'd expect, it will create the kind of framework for either the WebAssembly version or for the server version. So let's have a look what happens if we do call that --help command that I mentioned on my slide there. Because what it will do is it will list out all of the options that we have and for new Blazor projects, all of the different parameters that we might have. If it loads. Oh, here we go. So what that does is it lists out all of these different parameters we can pass in when we are doing .NET New Blazor Server, for example, or Blazor Web Assembly in this example. And you can tell it which framework you want to use, and it lists out which the default one is. You can say, is there auth, is it hosted? You can pass in all of these different parameters. I'll not go through them all, don't worry. PW is an interesting one, we'll chat a wee bit about that later. And we can pass all of these in the command line when we're creating our app, and it will spin up a solution and it will have all of these items configured in it, which is really cool. But what I thought we could do is look at the Visual Studio version of this. So if we open Visual Studio to create a new project, you'll probably recognise this screen that loads. And if we search for Blazor in here, it will give us the option of a Blazor Server app or a Blazor WebAssembly app. So let's, for this example, we'll have a look around the Blazor WebAssembly option. So we can give it a solution name that we want to give it. And we can choose the framework. So I've chosen .NET 5, that's the default one, that's the most recent stable release. And as mentioned in the command line options, we can select different parameters that we want to take place when we're setting up this solution. We could make it a progressive web app, we can say we're going to host some of it in .NET Core, or we want to configure it for HTTPS. And with authentication as well. But I'll leave it as a default and we'll click create, and then our solution will open and we can have a look around. So I don't know about what you all do, but when I'm looking at new frameworks or new technologies, I usually do a file new, I let it create all the scaffolded, all the templated stuff, and I have a look how it works, because it's the best way for me to see as a developer a working solution. I work best seeing how something that works and then changing it from there. So drag that over to that side of the screen. Perfect. I'll take you a little tour of the solution soon, but first I'm going to build it here. And what I think I'll do is we can open that in File Explorer. Oh, it's open here. Perfect. And what we can do is we can open up the command line, drag it over to that screen there, and we can run .NET Watch Run. And what that does is it will build the solution, it will open it in a browser, and it will also do a watch. So anyone that's used to kind of front-end development and JavaScript development, you'll know that this is part of the workflows. You can do a .NET watch, and anything you change in your code will update in the browser. So we can do that too. So we'll just let this load here. And there you go. This is the app that we've got in Visual Studio. So I'll take you a tour of the code soon, but I thought I'd show you how the actual app works first. So we have a nav down the side here. We've got our home page, a link to the counter page and to the fetch data page. And on the home page we have Hello World, no surprise there, and this little survey prompt, as it's called in the code, and we'll show you that soon. And when we click on the nav and go to counter, it takes you to a page with a counter, and when you click on the button, it increases the number on the page by 1 each time. And then on the fetch data, as you can see, it's loading a table of data, and it might look like nothing's really happening there, but when we have a look in the code later, you'll see that it is actually going in and fetching that data from somewhere. So this is the out-the-box solution, and we'll have a little look through the code for that and show you how it works. So let's go back to our solution. As with most places as a .NET dev, everything starts back with our program CS. So we can have a look in the main here. It's doing all the kind of set up stuff that we would expect it to do, and for our Blazor app, this is the main one here that tells it where the app is and how to get started. And you'll also see that it's adding some services, add scoped for HTTP client. We'll see that later. And this is the kind of base stuff that's set up for you. You don't really need to go in and change any of it for now, but it's still good to understand how it all ties together. So this is saying root components add app. So let's go and have a look at the app.razor. This has got a router component, and it's linking back to our program CS. But one of the main things here for me is that it's using the main layout. So that's telling it to render that main layout. And if you're used to working with MVC and with Razor, some of these concepts will be super familiar. And then if it's not found, it's also got a tag for not found. So in this example, we're saying still use the main layout, but say sorry, there's nothing there. But you might actually want a different layout if something goes wrong. But in this example, it's both. So let's jump in to the main layout and see what it looks like. It inherits from the layout component base, and you can have a little look into that in more detail. You'll see it's got our kind of standard HTML tags here, but it's got this one nav menu, and that's a custom component that we'll have a look at in just a second. And if you've used Razor with MVC, you'll be used to this app body. So that's essentially saying this is the layout and render all the stuff that's in the layout, but that app body is saying this is where we put the actual page body, the page context, and we'll have a look at some of the pages later. But this is what lets us, on that example that we looked at earlier, have that nav on the left hand side. But let's have a look at how the nav menu works. So it's also in the shared folder here because it's on every page, and as you can see, this has got our HTML for the nav. So it's got like the little intro up top, and then it's got each of our navigation items. So as you saw in the little demo we've done, we've got the home page, we've got the counter page, and we've got the fetch data page. And you'll see the hrefs here. We just have to say the name of the page. I'll show you how they're routed, how the page routing works in just a second, but that links back to just that there. And you'll see we've got our at code. So this is the interesting part as a .NET developer, right? As a C# developer, we're writing C# just here in the Razor view, which we know we can do in MVC and Razor in general, but this now is rendered in the browser. And here it's just doing a little bit of logic around toggling the menu items. So let's have a look at one of those pages in particular. So let's go to the home page. Good place to start. So as you can see, this is our home page. It's our index.razor, and this is how the routing works. It's an example of just the home page. So at page, and then in quotes the root that we want it to render on is how routing works. It's quite simple, quite easy to understand in Razor. So here it's just a slash, which is just the home page. We'll have a quick look in counter, for example. It's at page and then slash counter. and that tells it to render on the /counter URL. So yeah, it's quite intuitive, easy to follow. So we'll jump back to the home page, and as you can see, there's a hello world, and then there's this survey component that I mentioned when we done the demo. And what it's doing, again, there's a shared component here, and we can use that kind of custom HTML tag, pass in a parameter. As you'll see, we're saying the title, how's Blazor working for you? So when we go to the survey prompt, we can see this is the actual HTML that will be rendered. So in the home page, in index.razor, when we use that custom tag of survey prompt, this is what's actually rendered. And you'll notice here in the @code section, that's the parameter that we pass through. So we set title equals, and then we passed in a value here in the index.razor. That there, when you're inside the component, that title is defined in the @code, and then you can do @title when you want to output that in the Razor, and that's how we can pass variables around. So I'm going to go back to our index.razor, and we can see it says hello world. So I want to show you how we can make changes in React, not in React apps, in Blazor apps. So if I save that there, I'm not going to build it. But what I will do is I'll go back to our PowerShell window here, and you'll see that it's actually started building it for me. And that's what .NET Watch Run does. It's watching for changes, and it will wait until there is a change, and then it will rebuild, and it's going to refresh it in the browser for me here as well. So if we go back to the home, it's doing the refresh now. So we're still on the fetch data page. Let me go back to the home page, and you'll notice that it says hello world, and I said hello instead of hello world now, which is great. So it's really good for the workflow when you can just make your change, save it, and it automatically refreshes in your browser. I'm sure if any of you are .NET developers, you'll agree that's a real awesome step forward within .NET Core and .NET 5. So what we can do now is, let's have a look at how we can add a new page, a new route, and we can add it to the nav. So I'm going to just be a wee bit lazy, and I'll copy and paste our index, but I'll call it something else. I'm going to rename this one. I'll call it Scottish Summit, because why not? And we'll take out our survey prompt here. I can leave a little bit of text, and we can make it say hello Scottish Summit. But of course what we don't want to do is leave the route as is, because that route is already in use, isn't it? So let's change that to Summit. So we'll save that. Again, just to re-emphasize, you'll see there is a kind of building over here, and where's my browser? Here is my browser. So if I refresh this, it's still the same here, but if we go to /summit, that will refresh, and hopefully it will show our page. So because that's a new file in the solution, perhaps I do have to build it. Don't know what's happened here, so I'm going to close that .NET Watch and start again. So it's actually because of what I've called it. So we'll call that file Summit, and we can, this should work perfect now. So the reason that didn't work is because that was the namespace of my solution, so that's a bad example. Oh, still running there. So we'll go to /summit, and there is your page. So live demos, always fun. We'll work through it together as developers. That's a lesson learned on that one. And what we will do now is we'll add that one to the nav. So if I go back to my nav menu, I'm going to just copy and paste that one. And so how this links to the routing that we've done is what we've put as app page and then slash whatever we want the route to be. That's what we link to here, but we don't need the slash. So I'm just going to type summit here. And that should refresh in our browser. And you'll see it appear here. Perfect. So if we go there, that's our new page. We can navigate to it just like we can everything else. So let's have a look at some of the other pages and how the logic works for each of these, because it's each of the pages in the example actually shows something really important for getting started with Blazor. So within /counter, we have our count that we saw in the demo earlier, and what this does is it shows current count. So that's a variable that's defined in the @code section, and it updates whenever that's updated. So as you saw, there was no page refresh or anything like that. And how that's working is on the onClick attribute within the button, we are calling our C# code in the @code section. So I think that's pretty cool as a .NET developer to see that kind of on the JavaScript function that is calling C# code, and it's all happening within the browser, and it updates straight away and without having to refresh the page. So that's a really good example of how that one works. And if we have a quick look in the fetch data page, this one goes a little bit further. It's a wee bit more complex. So in fetch data, we're injecting that HTTP client. So that's the one that we had a look at earlier in the program CS, because we're going to use that. And you'll see that we've got an if, and it's checking that the weather forecast actually exists. And if it doesn't, it says loading. And when it does, it renders that table that we looked at earlier. So in the @code section, you'll see that it's setting up an array of weather forecasts. It's got an object that shows you what a weather forecast represents. So you've got your date, your temperature, your summary, your temperature. There's two different types of temperature. And on initialized async, so that's essentially on the page load of this page within the single page app. This is what it does. So it calls in await, and it goes and gets the weather forecast. So this is where, if it was real life, you would probably do an API call. But what it's doing is it's going to the sample data folder, and it's getting that data from the weather.json, which is in the web root here, sample data, and your weather.json. So you'll notice that on this page, and compared to the other pages, we have an if that actually checks that the data exists here. That's because this is an await and an async. So because when the page first loads, there might be no data. There might be a few seconds or a split second of when there's no data. So it will show that it's loading until that object is no longer null, and then it will render the table, which I think is pretty smart. And the example within the template that you get in Visual Studio here shows you how to do a few important things. It shows you're on initialized, it shows how to do async await, and it shows how to handle the situation where you don't actually have that data quite yet to use, and then replace the loading message once it renders. So that's really sweet. So one thing to show, I think it's quite cool, is I'm going to take away this weather forecast object, and I will create a new folder first of all. I'm going to say models. This is where we can keep our models. Say we don't want that to be in the @code within the Razor. We want to keep it in a models folder, maybe a bit more like the traditional way of working. and I will, no surprise, call that weather forecast. Helps if I spell it right, doesn't it? Perfect, that's going to be a class there. And what I can do is I'm going to replace that with the copy and paste object that I took out of the Blazor file. And what we can do, so you'll notice now we're getting our angry red squiggly lines to say that we can't find that object, but that's because we've moved it. So what we need to do here is say using and tell it that folder. So we've saved it in Scottish Summit, Blazor Web Assembly .models, and hopefully, yeah, no longer angry, no longer squiggly lines. It now knows where to find that object. And just to prove that that still works, we will go to our browser and we can still navigate around, because it still can go to fetch data, and it should load. Oh, still doing the build and reload there. Yeah, it's still doing fetch data and it's still rendering our data there. So we can refactor it to have the model kind of in its own class if we want to. We can have it in that code if we want to, and whichever way of whatever models that we like to work in, we can do within Blazor. We can still use a lot of the best practices that we do when we're writing our C# code. So that is the WebAssembly quick demo, and what I do have, here's one I made earlier, is a Blazor server version of the exact same application that I won't go into loads of detail because we've just been through it, and a lot of it, as you'll probably see on screen, is very, very similar. But what I wanted to do was show the slight differences that we've got. So we have our program CS. We're used to that. You'll notice it looks slightly different because it's got this create host builder, and it's actually telling it to go and use the startup CS, which again is a pattern that we're more than used to if we've used ASP.NET. So we have a startup CS. We didn't have that in the WebAssembly version. And I'll not go into lots of detail, but this is where it's doing all the configuration that we need it to do for server-side Blazor. And you'll notice it's adding a singleton instance here of this weather forecast service. And that's another thing that we don't have in our WebAssembly version. So what it comes out of the box in the server version is it's showing you how to create services, how to inject those as singletons, and how we can use them within Blazor. So in here you can see it's got some logic on types of weather and getting that weather forecast. So if I go into fetch data, we'll notice it's the same markup, but one of the main things that's changed is the using. They've already done what I done earlier and made the model a separate class, and we've also got our service, so it injects the service in there, whereas in the WebAssembly version it injected in the HTTP client, didn't it? So down here on initialized async, again it looks very familiar, but what it's doing is it's calling the service that we have here on the server side, rather than having the HTTP client calling the get async within the code in the Blazor. So slightly different ways of doing things, and I think it is really good. I really would recommend, if you're having a look at getting started with Blazor, just to do what I've done right here and on screen with you today, is set up a WebAssembly version, have a play around with it, add some stuff, delete some stuff, break some stuff like I did. Do the same with the server side, get to know the differences between the two. And as you can see, there are enough similarities that if you start off as server side and decide to move it to WebAssembly, or the other way around, a lot of your Blazor or your Razor views for Blazor will be reusable. So it's definitely worth having a play with both. Maybe try and build the same thing in both and see how it works. So what we'll do now is we'll jump back to our slides. So what have I learned about using Blazor? It's very quick to start building because I'm already a .NET dev, I'm already a C# dev, so it really was like literally what I've done today, you know, file new in Visual Studio and just having a click around and breaking some stuff and adding some stuff to see how that it works. there were quite a few updates, and because I started using it when it was in beta, and because it is still quite new and evolving really quickly, which is great, there's a few updates to the framework. So every time I found that I went away and came back, so I've given this talk a few times, and each time I give the talk, there's a few slight changes that I need to get up to speed with. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on if you decide to use Blazor, that it's changing quickly. The dev community for me is a really big thing about adopting a new framework, deciding that a new framework's the one for me, and I would recommend, if you want to have a look at Blazor and see people that are actually, you know, building packages, building components and using Blazor in production, is to have a look at Awesome Blazor on GitHub. As the name suggests, it shows off awesome Blazor projects that people are doing and really shows off the power of the technology. And for me, if developers are using it and writing about it and sharing it, then that's usually a good sign for a new framework. So hosting's a really interesting one. As we know, as .NET devs, with .NET Core, hosting got a lot more different. We can host it in different platforms. And with Blazor, it's no different. You can, in Visual Studio, if you click publish, it gives you these different options that I'm sure you'll recognise. You can host it in Azure, you can host it in Docker, you can put it to a folder and you can do what you want that folder, FTP it or host it in IIS, and you can set up different profiles as well. And one thing that I found really, really interesting was this post on dev.to, where you can host Blazor in a WebAssembly version on GitHub Pages. So if anyone's used GitHub Pages, it's great because it means that you can put code in a repo and it will be hosted online, run there for you, and you don't have to worry about hosting. And for .NET code, that wasn't really an option because you kind of needed to have, you know, .NET running on the server that you're hosting it on. But with WebAssembly allowing us to deploy static apps, we can host it on GitHub Pages. And I have done it, and it was really quick to take what we had done on the Getting Started template in Visual Studio into being hosted on GitHub Pages. So I really would recommend having a wee play with that. It's good fun. And when we're chatting about hosting, it's probably a good time to come back to this conversation around server versus WebAssembly, and, you know, why are there two different versions, and when would you use the different variations. So what I thought we would do is let's chat about the positives and negatives of each, because there are, as with everything, pros and cons to using different things. So Blazor server side has the advantage that the download size is significantly smaller than the WebAssembly app, and that the app itself loads much faster. And the app takes full advantage of server capabilities, so including any of the .NET Core compatible APIs, and also a lot of the .NET tooling, like debugging, that we're used to using, just works as expected. And thin clients are supported, so Blazor server apps work with browsers that don't support WebAssembly. And, you know, until that becomes a standard thing that all browsers support, this is a real advantage for Blazor server side. And the .NET and C# code base, including the app's component code, isn't served to the clients, so that's all kept on the server. There are, however, some negatives. So there's higher latency, so each user interaction involves a network hop, so that's SignalR connection that we saw earlier. And there's no offline support, so I know I didn't really go into the PWA chat, but that's a big thing for progressive web apps, is having offline support. So if that's something that's really important to you, Blazor server side's probably not the one. Scalability for challenging apps with many users, so the server still must manage all of those connections, whereas if it's Blazor WebAssembly, then there's no talking to the server, so there's less load on them. And for ASP.NET Core, the server is required to serve the app, so it kind of limits some of those hosting options that we discussed earlier. You can't host it in GitHub Pages, for example, or behind a CDN, or on a CDN, sorry. For WebAssembly though, there are pros and cons too. So some of the advantages are there's no server-side dependency, the app's fully functioning after it's downloaded to the client, and the client resources and capabilities are fully leveraged. The work is offloaded from the server to the client, and the .NET Core web server isn't required to host the app. You could host it on a CDN, GitHub Pages example again. However, there are the negatives of the app is restricted to the capabilities of the browser and capable hardware and software. So, for example, having WebAssembly support is required. And as mentioned, the download size is larger. It has to get the .NET runtime, it has to get all of your code down, so it takes longer to load. And the .NET runtime and tooling support is less mature just because, you know, it's not been going for as long. So as you can see, performance is one of the things for WebAssembly that's quite an interesting one. The initial load time is significantly slower than the server version, like mentioned. However, there aren't those network hops with each interaction, so initially the load time is slower, but then perhaps it's quicker when using the app. So these are all things that we'll need to consider when deciding what the right technology is for our clients and for our projects. So what's next for Blazor? Blazor is relatively new, and as with everything, it will keep evolving. There's Blazor PWA, so Progressive Web Apps, like we've chatted about a few times now. And I know that there's some kind of hybrid and native bindings to use in like Xamarin and for mobile development that lets us use Blazor there. I haven't looked into it in a whole lot of detail, but I do know that there is some kind of experimental work going on there to see how it could work. And just last week, .NET 6 Preview 1 was announced, which it feels like we've only just got .NET 5, but .NET 6 will be out very end of this year. And I know that Blazor Desktop is a really big thing that they're working on, so they're going to be allowing us to use the same technologies, web technologies essentially, but to work in desktop apps. So if that's something that you need to do for your projects, is have a desktop app, I would really recommend following along with those blog posts for .NET 6. And similarly, I think we know that WebAssembly Blazor performance isn't as optimized as it could be, and that's a big focus for .NET 6 as well. So hopefully some of those cons that we saw on the pros and cons list are ironed out for .NET 6. And with .NET 6 being the long-term support version, then hopefully it's a lot more improved and it is one that can be, you know, production ready. And a big thing for me to see what's next for Blazor is the developer adoption. Where is it used? Are there any big apps that are working on Blazor and that gives us real case studies for kind of scale that Blazor can be used in real life projects? So I'll be really interested to keep an eye out on that and see where Blazor is used in the real world. So earlier on I had my slide that was kind of before, now and future. Is Blazor the future? I'm not sure yet. I think it's got a whole lot of potential. I don't think it's one of these things that will just disappear like Silverlight, for example. I do think it will be used. I think the power of it coming to desktop apps as well shows that Microsoft are really investing a lot of time and energy into it. So I do think that it's something to keep an eye on as a web developer and as a C# developer in general, and I'm really excited to see where it goes in the future. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was a nice, quick and useful getting started with Blazor, and that you will go off and have a play with it yourself. And let me know if you do. There's the hashtag Scottish Summit 2021. Let us know how it goes and let us know what you think of the day in general. And thank you so much for attending and for spending some of your time with me, and I hope you all have a lovely day.